When the German soldiers stepped off the truck in the hot Florida sun, they expected fear. They expected fists, shouting, rifles pointed at their faces, maybe even revenge for everything they had done in Europe. What they did not expect was silence, palm trees, and the distant sound of waves rolling gently onto a white sandy beach. For months they had been fed a steady diet of propaganda that described Americans as brutal, cruel, and hateful toward Germans. Yet here they were, thousands of miles from the war, standing on American soil, and nothing matched the stories they had been told. These men had been captured in North Africa and Europe, torn away from their units, and shipped across the ocean to a land they had only seen in enemy posters. Many of them were young, barely out of their teens. Some were hardened veterans. All of them were afraid. The idea of being a prisoner in enemy territory was terrifying. In their minds, captivity meant humiliation, starvation, and punishment. That was how their own government treated prisoners. That was how they believed America would treat them. But from the very first day, the truth felt wrong. They were not beaten. They were not insulted. They were given food, real food, more than many of them had eaten in months. Bread, meat, vegetables, even dessert. Guards spoke calmly. Some even tried to smile. The Germans looked at one another in confusion. This was not what they had been prepared for. The camp itself was surrounded by fences and guard towers, but inside it did not feel like a cage. There were clean barracks, showers, medical care, and organized routines. They were required to work, but the work was fair. They were paid small wages, which they could use to buy extra food or small comforts. They were allowed to read, to play sports, to write letters home. Compared to the hunger and chaos they had left behind in war-torn Europe, it felt almost unreal. Still, they did not trust it. German propaganda had taught them that Americans were soft on the outside but cruel underneath. Many believed this kindness was a trick, a way to make them drop their guard before something terrible happened. So they stayed alert, they watched the guards. They waited for the cruelty to reveal itself. Then came the day that changed everything. It started like any other morning. The Florida air was already heavy with heat. Palm trees swayed in the distance beyond the fences. The prisoners were lined up for roll call when an officer gave an unexpected order. A group of German POWs was to be taken out of the camp. Nobody said where they were going. Immediately, fear spread through the ranks. Were they being transferred? Punished? Interrogated? Some men whispered that perhaps they were being taken somewhere to be executed. Others believed it was a propaganda stunt. No one knew. They were loaded onto trucks, still guarded, still uncertain. As the trucks drove on, the prisoners watched the scenery change. The dusty roads gave way to greener land. Then suddenly, they saw something that made no sense at all. The ocean. Blue water stretched to the horizon. White sand glowed under the sun. It looked like a postcard. For men who had spent years in trenches, in burning deserts, and on ruined battlefields, it felt like another world. The truck stopped near the beach. The guards told them to get out. The prisoners hesitated. Their hearts pounded. This had to be some kind of trick. But the guards were relaxed, almost casual. One of them pointed toward the water and, through a translator, gave an order that no one expected. "You can go swimming." At first, nobody moved. The idea was impossible to believe. Prisoners of war were not supposed to swim freely on a beautiful American beach. That was not how war worked. That was not how enemies were treated. One man stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, as if the ground itself might explode. He took off his boots. Nothing happened. He removed his shirt. Still nothing. He walked toward the water. The guards did not raise their rifles. They did not shout. They simply watched. Then he touched the water with his foot. It was real. Within minutes, disbelief turned into amazement. The German prisoners rushed toward the sea. Some laughed. Some cried. Some stood in the water with their eyes closed, letting the waves wash over them. For the first time in years, they felt something other than fear. The guards sat on the sand, smoking cigarettes, joking among themselves. They were not worried. They were not tense. They treated the prisoners like human beings. For many of those German soldiers, this was the moment when everything they believed about America collapsed. They had been told Americans were monsters. But monsters did not allow their enemies to enjoy the ocean. Monsters did not offer kindness to men who had worn the uniform of Hitler. That day, the war inside their minds began to change. Back at the camp, conversations were different. The prisoners talked about what they had seen. They talked about the food, the freedom, the strange friendliness of their guards. Some began to question the propaganda they had grown up with. If Americans were truly evil, why did they behave this way? Letters home became more honest. Some wrote that they were being treated well. Others dared to write that America was not what they had been told. These letters were read by censors, but many still got through. In Germany, families began to realize that the enemy was not the devil they had been taught to fear. Over time, the camp became more than a place of captivity. It became a place of reflection. Some prisoners began learning English. Others read American newspapers. They listened to the radio. They learned about democracy, about free speech, about a world very different from the one they had known. Not all of them changed. Some clung to their beliefs. Some refused to accept that they had been lied to. But for many, the beach in Florida became a symbol. It was the moment they realized the world was not as simple as good and evil as Germany versus America. When the war finally ended, many of these men returned home to a country in ruins. But they carried something with them that could not be bombed away. They carried the memory of a place where their enemies had treated them with dignity. Some of them would later say that it was not the defeat of Germany that changed them, but their time as prisoners in America. Because that was the day they realized that America was different. As the weeks passed after that unforgettable day on the Florida beach, something invisible but powerful began to shift inside the camp. The German prisoners no longer walked with the same defeated, guarded posture. They were still prisoners, still behind fences, but they were no longer trapped in the same way in their minds. They had seen something that could not be erased. The enemy had treated them like men, not like animals. For many of them, this was the first time in their lives that authority had not been built on fear. Back in Germany, discipline had always come with punishment. Orders were not questioned. Mistakes were met with cruelty. Even within the German army, soldiers were often treated as expendable tools. Yet in America, even as prisoners, they were given choices. They could work in fields, in factories, or inside the camp. They could earn money. They could refuse certain tasks without being beaten. This kind of freedom, even within captivity, was something most of them had never known. One prisoner named Karl began to keep a journal. He had been a schoolteacher before the war. In his notebook, he wrote about the strange feeling of being safer among his enemies than he had ever been among his own officers. He wrote about the beach day again and again, trying to understand why it had affected him so deeply. It was not just the water or the sun. It was the trust. The Americans had trusted them not to run, not to attack, not to betray that moment. And that trust had changed something inside him. Trust creates responsibility. When you are treated like a criminal, you begin to act like one. When you are treated like a human being, you start to remember that you are one. That quiet truth spread through the camp. The guards noticed it too. Fights between prisoners became less frequent. Discipline problems dropped. Some guards even began having small conversations with the Germans, talking about families, farms, and ordinary life. They were not supposed to become friends, but war has a way of bending rules. One American guard had grown up in Florida not far from the camp. He had never met a German before the war. He had been told they were cruel, heartless people. But now he watched them laugh, argue, play soccer, and write letters home. He realized they were just men caught on the wrong side of history. He once told a prisoner, through broken English and gestures, that before the war he had dreamed of being a fisherman. The prisoner replied that he had dreamed of being a musician. For a moment, the war disappeared. Some of the German prisoners began to play music in the evenings. They formed small bands using homemade instruments or ones provided by the camp. Americans would stand outside the fence and listen. The melodies carried sadness, hope, and longing. It was impossible to hear that and still think of the musicians as monsters. The beach trip had done more than give them a day of freedom. It had shattered a lie. As months turned into years, news of Germany's defeat began to filter into the camp. The prisoners listened to the radio in silence as they heard about destroyed cities, millions dead, and a nation in ruins. For many, it was like losing their entire past. Everything they had believed in was gone. But they were not alone. American officers gathered them and explained what would happen next. They would eventually be sent home. They would not be punished just for being German soldiers. They would be allowed to rebuild their lives. Some prisoners wept when they heard this. They had expected hatred. They had expected revenge. Instead, they were being given a future. One man said later that the day on the beach had prepared him for that moment. It had shown him that the world was bigger than propaganda, bigger than war. When the first groups of prisoners were released and sent back to Europe, many of them did something that surprised the guards. They shook hands. They said thank you. Some even hugged the men who had once pointed rifles at them. They did not thank them for capturing them. They thanked them for treating them like human beings. Years later, some of those German POWs returned to America, not as prisoners, but as visitors. Some even immigrated, choosing to build new lives in the land that had once held them behind fences. They brought their families. They told their children about the strange day when they had been taken to a beach by their enemies. That story was passed down. And in quiet moments, long after the war, those former prisoners would remember the sound of the waves and the feeling of freedom that had come even in captivity. Because that was the day they realized America was different.